Welcome to the Money to the Masses podcast, putting you in control of your finances. One mic, two idiots, and, according to our latest figures, 3 listeners. Here are your hosts, Damien Fay and Andy Leaks.
Before we start, Andy, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to our podcast sponsors, Money Farm. Now, Money Farm are the largest digital wealth manager in Europe, and they create portfolios of ETFs for their clients. They're incredibly cheap and ideal for somebody who's wanting to get into investing, and perhaps for more experienced investors who don't actually want to run their own money anymore. Now, they will even offer to run the first £20,000 of any of our listeners' portfolio absolutely free if they enter the code MTTM20K into the website at moneyfarm.com. For more information, check out their website. But for now, Andy, let's get back on with the show.
Hello and welcome to episode 134 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, how you doing? Welcome back.
It's good to be back, Andy. We had a slight... we did something slightly different last week, didn't we? So we're back to normal this week.
Yeah, a little bit of a hiatus, gave the listeners something a little bit different, and hopefully they enjoyed it. I certainly did.
Yeah, me too. It was one of my favourite episodes of the One Giant Leap podcast, so I would have enjoyed it. So what have you been up to this week anyway? Or the last 2 weeks, really, Andy?
Yeah, recovering from that cracked rib. I think we talked about it a couple of podcasts ago. Still suffering the effects of it, so... I find it really difficult to laugh. So actually, it's really nice to spend some time with you because I'm
You're laughing. That gag didn't work there, did it, Andy? Because you were going to say, I didn't laugh at all. And now you're laughing. And Andy is quite rightly holding his ribs. And I don't feel sorry for you at all, Andy.
We've had a nice bank holiday weekend, of course, as well. And we've been away as a family just for a couple of nights. And yeah, it's all been good. How is you?
I went to the beach. So the family and I, we went to the a beach down on Camber Sands, which is on the south coast, and it's a lovely sandy open beach. But it's one of those occasions where the primary school, my oldest daughter's primary school, had a inset day, which basically means they're closed for the day, and hardly any other school did. So we went down there and had an empty beach basically to ourselves. So it was amazing, and it was really hot too, so I had a great time.
Really hot, and it's a sandy beach down that way, and I think they've got like a shack where you can get an ice cream and drinks, and it's just
it's not much down
back to
there.
basics.
But it's really good. So yeah, it was a bit of it wasn't a staycation, but it was it had a real holiday feel about it, even though I was in the UK. So no, it's brilliant.
Good. Okay, well, to the money stuff, I feel like the listeners deserve like an action-packed episode this week.
Well, I'll tell you what, Andy, it is. There are 3 very good pieces. There's one that has it does have a holiday theme to it. So the first piece, we'll do them in this order actually. There's been a lot on the news about British Airways and their computers bringing their whole fleet to a halt. And there were a lot of people in the half term who unfortunately were stuck in the UK or wherever they were, and their flights weren't going. So I'm talking about flight delay compensation, because the rules are a little bit complicated and people don't seem to know what the rules are. And actually, British Airways themselves, when they were sending out details to people and the passengers who'd been affected, they weren't actually specifying explicitly some of the compensation claims and procedures. So I wanted to go through that because it's a one to bear in mind for this summer. I also wanted to talk about something to do with drawing money from your pension. There was an interesting piece of research around that could shed a bit more light on it. We did something on it a few podcasts ago, but it's adding a bit more layer to that. And the final thing is something I want to pick up from on 80/20 investor theme. I did a piece of research around whether fund managers are just plain lucky, and I'm going to give you a little bit of that, so people, just to tease people with, and actually be fairly useful.
Good stuff. Okay, so with the flight delays, and I suppose, well, it was a terrible weekend. Just from my Facebook feed, I saw at least 7 or 8 people that were affected by it. And funnily enough, most of them were happy about it because they were already in their destinations and they got an extra day's holiday. Some of them got money on top of an extra night's hotel. So it was all good for them. But obviously, it's not always good news.
No, so every cloud has a silver lining, and they happen to be evidently your friends, Andy, so they were lucky on that respect. It's one of those things with flight delays. It's all to do with consumer rights, and there's a lot of misinformation about some of this stuff, and it's not until you get a situation like this that you sit down and go and find out, well, what are the rules around it. So that's what I've done, and it's quite useful for people who are going away. Now, the rules are based around an EU regulation. So anybody who voted for Brexit, all what I'm about to tell you is likely to disappear when we finally leave the European Union. So this sort of compensation rules that are coming in and money are likely to go, but that's not been confirmed. So that's a byproduct of Brexit. So flight delay compensation. Now, it's actually only for EU regulated flights, and the rules around that, an EU regulated flight is in fact a flight where it's departed from an EU airport, regardless of the airline, or where an EU airline landed at an EU airport. So to give an example that Martin Lewis himself I saw gave on the TV, if you had a delayed flight from Manchester to Miami, that would qualify regardless of the airline, yet a flight from Miami to Manchester, you're entitled to compensation if you flew with the likes of Virgin or KLM, but not if you went via Air India.
Right.
So it's a slightly quirky rule, but the upshot is you largely were going to be covered. Now, the amount of cover you're going to get and compensation is based in euros, because it's a European rule, and it's between 250 euros and 540 euros. And you'll actually qualify if your plane is late by up to at least 3 hours, and you can make a claim. It doesn't have to be, you don't have a time limit as such within like 24 hours. You have 6 years to make a claim. So the people who've been involved in this delays with British Airways, technically it could be backdated 6 years. So you need to get your claims in. But the rules also apply for flight compensation if your flight is cancelled. So that can be cancelled while you're stood at the airport, or if it's cancelled within 7 days of you due to fly. And now, of course, there was another thing that people were talking about, what happens with replacement flights and how do the rules impact them. Now, you're still entitled to compensation, and this is where the rules get a little bit cloudy, but if your replacement flight still arrives at least 2 hours late, you can get compensation. Or if it departs more than an hour earlier, it seems to be, that's a slightly odd one. So your flight is either, let's say it's cancelled and you've got an alternative, but it leaves more than an hour before you should have done, then you can get compensation then, because it's obviously not in that window when you expect it to go. So the upshot is you can get compensation. Now, a lot of people would think that obviously you've got to complain to the airline first and foremost, and therefore you may be able to get this compensation. A lot of people always automatically assume you have to go to your insurer, but don't forget your credit card company is also liable under the Consumer Credit Act, because obviously you haven't received the goods that you paid for, so that was the flight, so they are also liable. Actually, your insurer is the place of last resort where you could actually get money back for a flight delay or cancellation. So to sum up this piece, there is compensation available if your flight is delayed by at least 3 hours, or it's been cancelled, and it can be while you're at the airport or within 7 days. So make sure if you're caught up with any of this in this British Airways glitch, or if there's any issues in the summer, just to take down all the details and confirmations of when your flight was meant to leave and when it actually did. And then you could get a few £100 back.
Amazing. Good stuff. It's always been one of those things that I never know quite what the rules are, and that's nice to tidy that one away.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real thing there is that there are rules, because most people don't realise there are compensation rules that the airlines have to adhere to. I think partly that's because there was a bit of wiggle room for quite a few years where airlines could refuse claims, and then there was a court ruling that went through that actually closed some of the loopholes they were using, which is why you start getting all this, a bit like the PPI stuff. You get these, have you had a delayed flight, and you hear the adverts where people are going to go, no fee,
they started that already.
It's kind of, they're doing that to try and claim back your money for delayed flights. And now you don't have to pay someone to do it, you can do it yourself. And the likes of Money Saving Expert, there's plenty of places that have got guides on how to do it. So the main thing is, if you are delayed, then that 3 hour limit is one crucial thing to remember, and you can make a claim.
Did you see recently in the news about a couple that put in a claim subsequently, quite a few years later, about being sick at a hotel, and they were putting in a claim to the hotel that they lost part of their holiday? Because again, the same rules within 6 years.
It's something like that.
Yeah, and the hotel went back over their video camera footage like for years and years back and found this couple and found them drinking in the bar every night, having a lovely time, and put in a counterclaim and sued them for defamation of their business. Because they were going all over Facebook saying that this hotel is terrible, and it turns out that it was a completely bogus claim. They found out that they could claim because it was a few years later. They thought, well, no one's going to know whether we did or not, and the company actually went back over their video, like CCTV footage, and found this couple because they knew the window with which the couple stayed, and they'd saved all the tapes.
I have to say, Andy, I really like that.
So do I.
Because the thing is, there are a lot of people who, I mean, how many times do we get calls about, oh, I've had so many calls, yeah, well, I hear you've been in an accident, or text messages. I've never been in a car accident, yet they still do it because there are people who are encouraged to make whiplash claims. And there was a case of a woman who did make a whiplash claim, who then got found out, and actually that's fraud. So you can get into a hell of it's actually illegal for starters, and get a hell of a lot of trouble for doing it. So good on that hotel for trying to oust those sorts of people. Because although I'm all for people getting compensation, but if it's due.
Yeah. Good. Okay, what we got next?
Right, pensions and drawing an income from pensions. Now, it's a topic we mentioned relatively recently on the podcast, and someone asked my opinion of how to do it. And interestingly, it was in the Telegraph, but there was, I don't know who the people, it wouldn't have been the Telegraph who did the research, but there was a bit of research that was carried out. And I'm not going to even pretend it was the most comprehensive piece of research I've ever seen, but it threw up some nice examples. Now, what they did is they went and looked at the last 2 years. Why just 2 years is because it was the period where we had those pension freedoms. The pension freedoms that allow us to go and raid our pensions and buy Lamborghinis, as they claimed everybody would, but no one actually ever did, as far as I know. If you did, then get in touch, because I find it interesting anyway to find out if anybody did. But they looked at these 2 years and went, well, okay, people can start raiding their pensions. What would have happened if they did? Now, the research, they looked at 3 ways of raiding your pension, and it wasn't really raiding it. It was just doing fairly sensible withdrawals. So they looked at the idea of, if you try to match the equivalent of an annuity for a 65-year-old man, that was their example, that's about 5.16% is was the equivalent percentage annuity rate. So that means for £100,000 you generate just over £5,000 a year. So £100,000 pension pot, you'd get £5,000 a year before tax. So they wanted to try and see if they could replicate that with what is known as drawdown. They also decided, could they do something where they did a slightly lower rate but a 4% equivalent income, and increased it with inflation, and then the natural income route, so the dividends and things that were paid. Now, anybody who listened to the podcast recently will remember that I was singing the praises and the virtues of the latter method. So if you had a pot of money, I was saying one of the better ways to actually try and live off that is, rather than try and hammer it and keep taking chunks out, then what would happen is, if the markets dip, you're taking out a bigger percentage of that pot of money, and then when it recovers, if it does recover, you ultimately end up with less money, and you end up having to take bigger and bigger chunks, and so your money runs out effectively. Now, if you take the natural income, it doesn't matter what happens to the pension pot size, because the shares produce a set income. So let's say they produced a certain amount of income, 4p for every share. Because the number of shares you've got, it's irrelevant of their price, you're getting a set yield. So what they did with this piece of research, they looked at the last 2 years, and they did also, with those different withdrawal rates, they looked at, well, what would happen if we'd have put £100,000 in an all-share tracker, FTSE all-share tracker, and an alternative was to look at a multi-asset portfolio, so that's looking at things, commercial property, bonds, equities, and then they looked at a more basic model, 60% equities, 40% bonds, and they wanted to look at what that combination and sort of permutations over 2 years of the markets going up and down, because the markets were effectively V-shaped. So from that period 2 years ago, they plummeted and then they rocketed after the Brexit. So it was this nice V, and they wanted to see what would happen, which was the best method. So what was the most sustainable withdrawal rate, and what was the best asset mix you could have to try and produce an income that didn't hammer your pension pot.
Okay.
Now, the first thing to say is that 2 years is a ridiculously short period of time to do it. That doesn't prove anything. But what they found was that during that period, the 100% equity portfolio, that version, fell at most 10%. So you lost 10% of value at one point, and then it rebounded. But of course, it rebounded the most after the Brexit vote, which obviously it would do. It fell the most beforehand. Now, the 100% equity, if we just focus on that portfolio for now, so you're just looking at the different types of variations of income, they found if you tried to match an annuity, you would have produced a fairly hefty, like nearly £9,890 of income, but your pot would only be worth 103,000 rather than 100,000, so it's only marginally more. Now, at the other end of the spectrum was if you just took the natural growth that came out of your pension pot, you'd have been able to take an income naturally of just shy of 6,000. So it's 5,900, but your pot would have grown to 107,974. So it's nearly 108. So if you added your capital growth to your income, then the winner clearly was to take a natural income. So you actually survived. You're getting a decent enough income, but your pot wasn't being decimated because it was just there fluctuating along and it was rebounding. The problem is that didn't produce the most income. So if you wanted more income, the simple answer was you had to take more money, which isn't earth-shattering. Now, the really interesting point was they looked at the different types of which was the most sustainable with his equity, whether it was any different if you did a multi-asset approach or you did bonds and equities. And funnily enough, the overall probably most positive outcome was if you took a multi-asset approach, and so that was investing in lots of different assets, they found that it had the smallest losses in terms of capital value, so it didn't dip as much when the market fell, which makes sense because it wasn't just all equities, but it also produced a fairly hefty natural income of £9,000. So over the 2 years, it was actually probably the better method. You did something that was very well diversified, different assets, and it also produced a fairly decent income as well. So, but that was only a 2-year window. The one thing I would point out about that, which is still why I would always personally favour veering towards equity income, going for things that produce sustainable dividends that have been proven over years, is that if you get into a bear market, which will inevitably happen, so that means that the market starts to, generally speaking, head southwards and heads down, then even if you're in a multi-asset approach, you would, to offset that, would take some doing, and you're still going to be taking some hefty chunks of income, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I still prefer the equity income over a long period of time. It'd be great to see this research done over 20 years, but unfortunately they don't have that data going back. But the overall winner in 2 years was taking a natural income, actually, with the multi-asset approach. That was the overall winner. So yes, natural income was the winner, but a multi-asset approach was the winner rather than an equity approach, which was very interesting. So I just thought I'd throw it out there to anybody who's trying to take their pension. While I personally would favour equity income, it does show you that if you diversify, there's lots of ways to diversify your income. And with 80/20, I once did a piece on diversifying income, and if you want to have a look, there'll be an advert in a second that tells you how you can do a bit of 80/20 investor, but you can get commercial property, you can get bonds, and you can get equities that can help. But the equity income will still be the one that keeps pace with inflation the most. That's the real thing that I should be hammering home, really.
That's the takeaway.
That's the takeaway, is that equity income won't win in all instances, but it's the one that will grow your income over time. Bonds and the others tend to be fairly flat. Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 Investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insights, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries, and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers in the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service. Let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show.
Damien, I've got a question for you.
Yes.
Are fund managers just lucky?
Well, Do you know what it is? I think the short answer is...
You don't have to answer that. You can go into the piece where we then sort of dissect it and then come out with the answer.
But what I'm going to do is usually say this is the short answer and then veer off into a 10-minute sort of waffle.
Yeah, let's just go how we normally go.
Stick to what we normally do. The short answer is that probably a lot of them are, but there are some that aren't. And the reason I know this is I did a piece of research for 80/20 investor members to try and see if fund managers were lucky or if they generally are. The ones that outperform, is that just down to luck? And I sort of come up with a way how I would test that. And the idea of the research came about because there was Vanguard. We mentioned Vanguard last week, I think it was, or the week before, who are big passive advocates and do lots of passive trackers. And what they do is you'll have a FTSE All-Share tracker very cheaply, and their ethos is that fund managers can't outperform in the long run. Now, while that is true that most can't and very few ever do, they do obviously have their day, and therefore you need to... Why 80/20 is all about trying to pick and choose and swap at the right times to maximise your returns. That's passive or active. I thought, well, is anybody consistent, or is it just down to by skill, or is it just down to pure luck? And how I did that was I went back and looked at the last 5 years. Now I picked the most recent 5 years because it was the most recent one that people know. And if I wanted to really make it definitive, I have to go back to nearly every period since FTSEs and everything existed. But for the most recent period, I sort of looked at that as a bit of a benchmark to see if there was a suggestion of luck. And I went through and looked at, just very simply, if we were to line fund managers up against a wall or whatever, and you just say, like,
shoot them all.
Shoot them all. No, if we lined the fund managers up against the wall, then by pure luck, then the chances of them being in the top half of a performance table at the end of 1 year is 1 in 2. It's just down to that. If it was just them throwing darts at a piece of paper that had share prices and share names on for companies, and they had to pick based on that, then they would be in the top half just by... And then you think, well, what would happen if it was the following year as well? So not only did they do it the first year, but they also managed to do it in the second year. Mm-hmm. Well, that's 1 in 2 again, but it's 1 in 4. And
yeah, there we go.
Repeat that for 5 years. It becomes more like 1 in 32. So in just pure odds alone, it's unlikely. But if you pick a large enough sample, then it should... what you should find is that either it's completely disproved, or maybe there are more than 1 in 32 if it isn't just down to luck. And I'm not going to give away what the research showed and the sort of nuances of it, but generally speaking...
And that's because that's exclusive member content.
Yeah, it's exclusive member content, but I do want people to have something to take away from it. It showed that the number of managers that managed their fee couldn't just be explained by pure chance alone. Now, it was a very small percentage of managers. It was less than 10%. I'm going to give you that much of a clue. But the number of managers that did it, and I show you who did, it is actually probably not down to just pure luck. Now, one of the other nuances of it, though, which I do explore in the piece, is whether they were lucky by what they chose to do. So the market and the environment around them just happened to fall into place to suit what they were doing. So it wasn't genius. Was it just the fact that the world changed and actually it suited them? Mm-hmm. A bit like a weird version of evolution, that the quirks they had benefited in that environment. So I think there's an element of that in it, but I don't think you can explain it all away. But equally, I looked at the other end of the spectrum, because if things were just down to luck, then there must be presumably a whole bunch of managers who are just unlucky, who just are at the bottom by pure bad luck. But when you then turned your sort of attention on the bottom chunk of people, there were too many people in the bottom very portion to be just down to bad luck. There were actually more in that sort of the pool of bad luck people than should be there. So actually, they
stands to reason that they might be poor managers.
Yeah, it just basically, to use a better word, just crap. So they are perennial people who just underperform. And now when you looked at the people that inhabited that, it was an interesting mix, because there were a number of trackers that were in there as well, things that are passive. And so what I looked at as well as part of the research was trying to understand what the lucky, in inverted commas, people were doing to be that lucky. They must have been doing something. And I've squeezed out what it is, there's certain factors. Now, what I will hint at is that one element really has to do with costs that they were controlling. And I worked out a figure, funnily enough, that if you wanted to increase your chances of being a lucky manager, there's a certain amount if you should charge people, and if you go above that threshold and become basically too expensive, your chances of being lucky were greatly diminished. And that obviously is down to, that's for 80/20 investor members. So that's something they can look for that as a benchmark. If a fund is charging more or less than this, then you're actually skewing the chances for or against you if you invest in it. And I suppose that was the big takeaway from the whole piece, that it's a bit like poker. So
I was going to bring up a poker analogy. I've been chomping at the bit, ready to pull out my analogy for you.
You go for it, Andy. You go for it.
I was going to say this is very akin to what I consider poker and poker players. You see the top poker players on the telly, and you're thinking to yourself, are they just lucky? How are they there? And then you've got a proportion of people who aren't lucky, and then you've got the turn of the cards, is the market conditions. And I'm thinking, there must be some similar stats and things that you can pull with poker, because it isn't just luck, obviously. There are the constant players that seem to be on the telly who are the best managers, in my analogy.
Yeah, and it's a good analogy, because what those people on the telly do, and if you never watched poker on TV, watch it. It's quite interesting. It's a purely mathematical.
So strange that we pulled that. I've got that analogy built up, and you just brought it up. Yeah.
Because what they do is they know with poker there's certain odds. So as soon as a player gets two cards in front of them, and when they're trying to make their best hand, the odds start calculating. They know what the odds are, and they'll say it's 17% chance of winning and all this sort of stuff. But the best poker players actually naturally start to be able to work those things out in their head or have a feel for it. But they probably just work it out in their head. So what they start doing is they start playing to try and stack the odds in their favour, so they've got enough out. Now, fund management and investing is kind of like that to a certain extent, because you could pick the absolute, what you think is the home banker of a bet on investing, and then the whole macro environment, something will happen like the Brexit thing that will just pull the rug from underneath you, and that's kind of down to bad luck. But the lesson to take from it is that there is an element of skill that is involved in the very best managers. Clearly have an element of skill, but there is still a huge portion of luck in terms of what goes on in the macro environment around them. So the investing world, if it goes in their favour based on what they're investing. And the takeaway for most people is the one way of you can very much try and stack the odds in your favour, based on this lesson of my research looking at it, is costs. Because it's the one thing you can control of nearly everything that's out there, is you need to know if you can control the costs of what you're buying, then you're going to start to stack your odds in favour of beating the market. And I'll give you a quick reason why that is. If you imagine there's an investment tracker, all it will do is track the market minus a bit for its charges. It won't be exactly the market because they've got to charge you something. If you get a very, very expensive tracker, so they charge you a lot of money to track the market, there will be 1 or 2% always below it, and that compounds over time. So that explains why you can end up being in the bottom portion of a fund table if you get an expensive tracker. So the lesson to learn is, if you control costs, you don't guarantee you're going to do well, you don't guarantee you're not going to do badly, but you start to stack the odds slightly in your favour, that you're more likely to finish higher than lower. And the other thing to take away is you need to know, almost like poker, which is where the analogy works really well, is when to stick and when to fold.
Yeah.
And clearly some of those managers have that, and they've managed to use that in the last few years. And of course, that's where the whole 80/20 idea, investor idea, comes from, is that we use a lot of statistics in that, and also research, like this piece of research I'm reading out now, which is trying to stack those odds in your favour. It's not guaranteeing you're going to be rich. I'm not guaranteeing you're going to make loads of money. But if you don't have the time, the effort, or the resources to analyse all this stuff yourself, it's why DIY investors can still make lots more money than a professional investor, because they start to stack the odds in their favour, and it therefore means that luck will play a part and they can do very well. And it's also why it explains why whenever I've played poker, the new guy comes along and then tends to always clear up, because of some portion is luck. But if they understand enough, it can get them so far. So it doesn't exclude people.
So that does explain why last time we had a poker night, I did clear up. And if we played again, I probably
Do you know what? I'd love to do a poker night with a whole bunch of people from who listen to this podcast and stuff. Because I once went to a poker night, and there was a whole bottom of a pub that was hideout, and everyone knew each other, and it was really good fun. And people think because I've got a mathematical background that I'd be brilliant at poker, and I'm not. I think I completely disengage my mathematical brain when I play it and just get almost reckless because I spend so much of my time with a mathematical mindset and sort of data and all that. I just feel like being reckless and just end up going. So maybe one day, if enough people want to play poker, we'll play poker one day.
Well, there we go, listeners. There's the challenge for you. Get in touch with Damien if you want to host a poker night. We'll be happy to come along. But for those listeners that aren't really into poker, who might be thinking, what are they on about poker? It's not as bad as it sounds. A lot of these poker events, they have buy-ins, don't they? And generally, you don't stand to lose any more than your buy-in amount, which is generally £5, £10. We're not talking about hundreds or thousands of pounds on a poker. I once said to my wife, I'm going to a poker night, and she went sort of white, and she thought I was going to lose like the family savings. I said, no, it's a load of friends around a table, and it's going to cost me like £10. Don't worry.
Yeah, I never play more than £5 in a go because I'm not a gambling man. But interestingly, a lot of investors and some of the traders are massive gamblers. And I think it's very easy to be a gambler when you're investing somebody else's money because it's not yours. So that's one of the things that... Another reason why I always invest my own money in 80/20 is because I don't want to lose my money, and therefore neither does anyone else who does it either. Whereas I think that if you invest somebody else's money, it's far easier to take a risk with somebody else's money than your own because... you're not gambling with your future or that of your children's.
Yeah. Good. We're all done. Enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was a good one, I think. We had a lot of stuff in there. Don't forget to go and subscribe to the One Giant Leap podcast if you haven't. After last week's little interlude, because that was it'd be good to try and support it. We're thinking of some new people to have on the next season. So please do get in touch if you have any ideas.
Some really exciting names that are being thrown about at the moment, so I can't wait personally for next season. So do that. Please do get in touch with any questions. As always, it's Damien at moneytothemasses.com or Twitter. Damien loves a Twitter question. It's at moneytothemasses with a number 2.
That's it, Andy. I'm all done.
Cheers. Bye.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.